All right, everyone, I'm going to kick us off for this third and final session. So you probably all saw me earlier, but in case not, I'm Jo Tompkinson, and I'm doing a postdoc on the ASA project that Julia's in charge of. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the third and final panel of the day. And we have in many ways saved the best for last. We've got three fantastic speakers lined up for you. And this final session's organising theme is imagining. And this includes papers that reflect on how buildings shape new possibilities and imaginaries of politics, and how people think about new possibilities for politics and living through the buildings that surround them. Our first speaker for this session is Daniel Mulugeta. He's a postdoctoral researcher at SOAS. His research looks at the connections between architecture and regional and Pan-African politics, and his papers about Pan-African imaginations and the African Union building in Ethiopia. So handing over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Jo. In Ethiopia and Nigeria. Next slide, please, Sunil. So this is the outline of my presentation today. I will start with a bit of a context, then I'll talk about my theoretical methods and methodology, then I'll talk about some of my research findings, and I will conclude. Next slide, please. So to give a bit of a context, my presentation will explore how the idea of Pan-Africanism is understood in Ethiopia and Nigeria by looking at the framing and the presentation of the African Union headquarters building in popular and elite discourses. So the African Union Commission headquarters consists of a conference center and a 20-story office complex fully funded, designed, built and furnished by China as a gift to Africa. The building was completed in 2012, creating at the time the tallest building in Addis Ababa. When it was completed, it was couched in terms of three dominant narratives by the African Union and the Ethiopian government. The first one was that it was seen as a material symbol for the African Renaissance, kind of a vision of a rejuvenation for the continent that is rising like a phoenix from the ashes of poverty, conflict, and colonialism. It was somehow thought to be reflecting the spirit of the renewal that dominated the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. The office complex itself, reaching a height of 90.9 meters, marks the founding date of the African Union. The second narrative was, it was presented as a symbolic expression of the growing friendship between Africa and China based on a new type of strategic partnership featuring political equality, mutual trust, and economic win-win cooperation. So it is a kind of critique of Western relations with Africa. So in order to represent this narrative, the panoramic view of the conference center features two hands holding each other, one being Africa and the other China. The third one, in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, in the Ethiopian government narrative, the building emerged as a symbol of a booming international city and symbolized the process of urban regeneration. So at the time, media images often used the silhouette of the building as a backdrop showcasing the city's rise and its embrace of the so-called modern architectural styles. Now, the question for me is, how do such narratives and indeed the materiality of the building inform Pan-African imaginations? How did the public react? How has it informed general public discussions about Pan-Africanism and the African Union? These are the questions that I want to explore not today. So next slide, please. So one venue to address these questions is to turn to the concept of imagination. In this regard, Benedict Anderson's analysis of how the spread of the concept of the nation is mediated by practice related to technologies such as print media offer a productive entry point. Of course, buildings are objectives of a fundamentally different sort. They are not like Anderson's print media that readily transmit ideas of the nation or collective identities. They are immovable objects which generate different sorts of imaginations through pupils' multiple forms of engagement with them. For this reason, I see buildings as technologies that provoke pupils' imagination through two sets of perceptions. The first has to do with a sensorial one, when people like through sight, touch, smell, and people's direct engagement with the buildings. The second set consists of communicating networks that are not necessarily direct or personal, such as oral transmission of narratives through television and print media. So the first one was a method I used when I was doing fieldwork in Addis Ababa. The second one is a method that I used when I was speaking to my informants in Abuja, Nigeria, because most people in Abuja never had that kind of direct experience with the AU built environment. So their knowledge comes from the media. So I basically use these two sets of perceptions to tease out how buildings produce Pan-African imaginations. Next slide, please, Sunil. So I used a multi-sited ethnography based on 4 months of research in Abuja and Addis Ababa. I chose the two countries because they are the two most populous countries in Africa, Nigeria being the most populous country in Africa, and Ethiopia followed by Ethiopia. So it provides a very interesting contrast. In terms of geographic location, while Addis Ababa is located on the eastern edge of Africa, Abuja is located on the west at the other end of the continent. This is also another interesting point to contrast the two case studies. Also, in terms of history, the two countries provides a very interesting contrast. Ethiopia was once one of the driving forces for Pan-African independence movement, much more so than Nigeria. But today, Nigeria seems to claim to better represent Africa. That's what I found out speaking with politicians in Nigeria and also ordinary people. However, one of the most interesting findings of this study has been that despite there are few material, cultural, or historical ties that link the two cities, my informants, as I will show later, expressed similar views concerning the organization, which is African Union, and the physical structure of the African Union built environment. What I found was that class and profession are much more important than geographic location and pupils' experience with the African Union building itself. So the kind of data collection methods I used include object-based interviews. So when I was talking to people, the central focal point of discussion was the building itself. I had a focus group discussion with civil servants, residents, and students, both in Abuja and Addis Ababa. I had also direct observations of the African Union built space and the people who work in and live around the building. So I had to observe how people come into contact with the building. All in all, my informants included Addis Ababa and Abuja residents, African Union staff members, academics, students, and architects in both countries. Next slide, please. So when it comes to findings, many of the people that I met during the course of my fieldwork, both in Abuja and Addis Ababa, dismissed the building as undesirable foreign imports. So, for instance, in Addis Ababa, most people would say that the building just doesn't strike the eye. My informants commented almost on every aspect of the building, including its physical, visual, aesthetic appearances. And every aspect of the building enables them to imagine Pan-Africanism and how it should be or should have been represented materially. In terms of its physicality, for example, a person whom I called Ahmed described it as if there's nothing striking in anything about it. It's all quite ordinary. There's no effort that has gone to make a Pan-African statement. So it's not African building. It doesn't represent them, and it's not Pan-African. So another architect from Abuja who had only had experience of looking at the buildings through the media described it as a copy and paste building. Another Nigerian academic who had the chance to visit the African Union building as a conference participant described it as remarkable in and of itself, but there is nothing African in it. Next slide, please. In terms of his color scheme, for instance, a person whom I called Hailu from Addis Ababa told me that the color of the building is not agreeable to an African eye. A dull appearance, which is a beige color, is not what we want to see in our Pan-African building. So he told me that he and others told me that African colors are bright, festive, and primary colors. And those kind of colors would have better represented Africa and African unity. In terms of material use, people believe that glass and concrete lack the symbolic the density of tradition and Pan-African authenticity. So most people in Abuja and Addis Ababa, the building has no reference to organic materials, which are seen as African and more sustainable. Organic materials such as wood provides the most immediate form of recognition. This is a comment from a person in Addis Ababa whom I called Michael. Another from Nigeria told me African materials such as stones, starch, melt, and other local materials are more accessible and more identifiable and more agreeable. But I should point out here that when my informants were talking about organic materials being African, they are not suggesting that the African Union building should have been constructed using such kinds, using for instance, mud or thatch or those kind of materials. What they were saying was that architects could have been more inventive in coming up with a clever way of integrating a reference to traditional way of building dwellings in Africa. Next slide, please. More than just simply referencing the architectural identity of the building, my informants used analogies that established a metonymic relation between the building and the African Union. So the building was, for instance, described to me by one informant in Addis Ababa as a snail, a befitting symbol to a sluggish and inefficient organization. It's not inspiring, it looks slow, it doesn't look African. The dome of the conference hall, for an example, has been metaphorically described as inverted beggar's bowl, signifying the begging bowl syndrome that refers to the continuation of some of the ways African leaders exploit the resources of dependence to finance their own programs. Another metaphor used when describing the African Union and Pan-Africanism concerns the African Union Grand Hotel, which is located inside the compound of the African Union. And it was supposed to somehow ease the burden of moving around when African leaders come to attend conferences. And the hotel is actually owned by a private investor, not by the African Union. So a diplomat based in Addis, for example, told me that the big men or African leaders are sitting tight at the heart of the continental organization. The allusion being here apparently to the phenomena of sitting tight syndrome, the ambition of African leaders to hold on to power and indulge in space of privilege and comfort. So the hotel, in my informant's imagination, transforms the African Union built environment into somehow a self-contained space where most of the needs of visiting Africa leaders are met. Next, please. And finally, I also want to talk a little bit about how the African Union staff members felt about the work, the place where they work. So there's a substantial difference in rank when it comes to how the African Union built environment was discussed by its staff members. So for most low-ranking AU members, the building is just embarrassing. They expressed a feeling of uneasiness and shame. For instance, one junior officer told me that he is acutely embarrassed by the sight of the building because it was received as a gift. And such acute recognition of negative emotions go beyond an experience of disappointment. Significantly, it disturbs the consistency of narratives and meanings of the African Union as an organization which works for achieving the goal of African solutions to African problems. On the other hand, most high-ranking officials saw the building as a blank canvas, which provides a kind of tabula rasa environment onto which material objects collected from different parts of Africa could be displayed, and in doing so, the place becomes encultured and transformed space. In a way, it becomes indigenized or Africanized through the display of artworks and photographs and so on. Just to conclude, next slide, please. While there are significant differences in the way my informants from two different countries engage with and experience the African Union built environment, both of them experience similar material sensations. There are indeed differences in class and profession. For ordinary residents of Addis Ababa and Abuja, the building is totally alien. However, cohesive Pan-African understanding doesn't emerge from the discussion of the building. My informant's idealization of Pan-Africanism is in itself selective, partial, in that it privileges particular traditions of architecture as universal. For example, when my Abuja informants talked about what better materially represent Pan-Africanism, they reference their own traditions. For instance, they talk about the Kanu architectural traditions and other building traditions in northern Nigeria. When Ethiopians talk about Pan-Africanism, they reference to the Rock-hewn church, the Ethiopian flag, and other architectural tradition in Ethiopia. So their understanding of Pan-Africanism is very, very selective and very partial. For many low-level officials in the AU, the building is totally foreign and is not informed by the ideals of self-reliance. However, as I mentioned earlier, the building for the more senior officials is just another workspace where Africanness can be expressed through artwork displays and the coming together of Africans. Despite its various expressions, the concept of Pan-Africanism, retrospectively idealized, serves as a resource for my informants in making sense of their sense of collective identity as well as material representations that they resist. It somehow transforms the reality of African diversity and difference into an imagined appearance of similarity. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Our next speaker is Tony Yeboah. He's a PhD candidate in history at Yale University, and his research looks at the history of the Asante Palace in Ghana. Handing over to you, Tony.
Thank you so much, Joe. So now, please, can I have my slide? I think I sent it. All right. Thank you. So my title has changed a bit, and so Instead, I have Asantean noumena, the politics and imaginary reconstruction of the Asante Palace. So let's get started with my outline. Please, can we move to the next slide? So I'll be looking at briefly the Asante British Wars between 1874 and 1896. And then I'll look at the outcome of the wars and move to discuss the administration of Asantean Opoku Ware II, who really is the focus of this paper. And then the unavoidable results of a necessary intervention. And finally, I'll look at the imaginary reconstruction of the Asante Palace. Please, can we move to the next slide? So before I start, I guess I didn't add methods for this. So let me briefly say something about my methods. So mainly I use archival, I use the archives and a bit of oral history. So I spent some time at the archives of the Asante Palace, which is housed in Kumasi at the Menchia Palace. And I also conducted extensive research with members of the Asante aristocracy, the chiefs, maybe the sub-chiefs of the Asante, so to speak. So between 1874, even before 1874, the Asante and the British had gone for war several times. But between 1874 and 1896, it got intense. And so in 1874, we have a situation where the British attack Asante at the heart of the Asante state, which is the capital, Kumasi. And then in the process, Kumasi was burnt, and the palace of the Asante was also burnt. And so please, can we move to the next slide? And so this, the burning of Kumasi, again, using the phrase, or the phrase from Daniel, presents sort of a tabula rasa for sort of a responsible planning in the city. And this was where an opportunity was presented for the reinvention of the Asante built space, beginning with the palace of the Asante in Menchia. So by the end of the Asante Wars, the Asante chief, which was Prempe the First, together with some members of the ruling class, they were repatriated to Seychelles. And in 1925, there was a call to bring the chief back, and including the other members of the ruling class. So in 1924, the British agreed to bring back Prempe, the Asante king. And so immediately that agreement was made. Discussion about where to house the Asante or where to accommodate the Asante people started talking about it, where they were going to receive the Asante. So in 1924, November 1924, Prempe arrives in Kumasi, but there was no palace to house him. So other sub-chiefs at this time agreed to accommodate him. But when Kumasi was burnt, in the end, colonialism was starting in Kumasi. And so the status of the Asante was reduced. So instead of being the king of the Asante, his position was reduced to the chief of Kumasi, so that the other states, so Kumasi was more like a confederate. So the other state, which with their chiefs who served the Asante, or declared their independence. And so the British agreed to build a palace for the Asante. And this palace, even though on the part of the British, they were to sort of build this palace to compensate Asante for the destruction in 1874, destruction of the Asante Palace. And this is fragments of the palace. But so in the end, the British will build a palace, but Asante will oppose this, and that they wouldn't want the British, they wouldn't want to give the British sort of the opportunity to build a palace to house their king. And for the fear that maybe later the British could come back and reclaim ownership of the palace. So they wanted to take absolute control of the palace. And so they agreed, they paid off, and then in the end, the Asante would occupy the palace. Even that, there was a pushback against the Asante moving into this palace, because this palace, I mean, again, reinventing the built space of the office of the Asante, was built in a way that it architecturally limited the role, the position of the Asante, now Kumasi. And so it was very tiny compared to the magnificent and very big, massive palace pre-1874 Asante. So we see that in the next slide, please, Sunil. So this is what the British built for the Asante state. And then, I mean, even though from the previous slides, we see a bit of fragments, but at least we could see that even one section of the palace was even the size of this. And so the Asante people, members of the Asante society, opposed the Asante moving into this palace because, one, they felt that it limited the space offered for the art of governance. But in the end, Prempeh, the repatriated Asante king, who agreed and then moved into the palace. And here my argument is that he agreed partly because when he was brought back, I mean, his sources of income was virtually tied to the British. So his personal upkeep and even catering for his extended family, he had to rely on the British for stipends to take care of those needs. And so it was understandable that he would push to the other elders of Asante society to allow him to occupy this newly built palace. And so in the end, the members of the Asante society reluctantly agreed, and then Prempeh is allowed to stay in this house. So he stayed in this house until his death. And please, can we move to the next slide? And so he dies, and then Prempeh II takes over. And so immediately he took over. He ruled, a bit of his administration was still within the British-built palace. But when Prempeh, Opoku Ware took over, he wanted to build a new palace for the Asante state, arguing that the space that the British-built palace provided didn't provide enough space to facilitate the expanding needs of the Asante and then the Asante. And really, I think that even though this is part of the argument he gives, but I think he again goes back to the concern raised by the members of the Asante state or the society that structure didn't facilitate local art of governance. So they wanted to get rid of it and to revisit, that elegant structure, a structure that befits, in their word, befits the Asante kingdom of the 18th and the 19th centuries. So he formed a committee, and then he instructed a committee to, quote, advise him on the technical issues relating to the proper housing of the Asante and the sacred regalia, end of quote, of Asante. So this was the mandate given to the committee, and the committee had really distinguished personalities, including the former president, John Ajay Kufuor. Please, can we move to the next slide? So Opoku Ware begins this project, but he didn't initiate it. So the project was actually started by Prempeh II, the one who took over from Prempeh I, the repatriated Asante king. So it was more like a continuation of what he inherited from Prempeh II. So when he took over, he started, in an Asante society, palace construction is a communal project. So he relied on the Asante, members of Asante society and the Asante fraternity for the rebuilding of the Asante palace. And so they started with a contribution civil societies, individuals gave. but they couldn't get the needed funds to build the palace they had in mind. So, and this was partly because at the time, Ghana experienced a lot of coup d'etats. So in the end, instead of building the imagined palace, Opoku Ware settled for the structure on our left. So he built this, I call it a very contested palace because he didn't have the money to build what he has in mind. So instead of traditionally having the female and the male section within, under one roof, he decided to separate the male section, which is the Asantean section, from the Asantean section. And also he brought in, he modified it, so to speak. He including what he called a guest house. And the guest house is on our right. It has been renovated. So in the end, even though Opoku Ware was committed to restoring that pre-1874 Asante Palace, he couldn't do it because he gave room for modernity. Here I'm using modernity to sort of look at European ideas of built environment, of building. So Opoku Ware built this structure and thinking that maybe a time was coming where he could raise the needed funds to build the imagined palace, but he never got the funds and he died. And so Asantean Osei the second takes over from him, and he continues the project under his flagship program called Pedicom. And we don't really know if really what they have proposed will come into reality. But as we speak now, the Asante Kingdom has not been able to rebuild the imagined palace, and now the current Asante continues to live in the guest house. He rules from the guest house, even though the plans are far underway to reconstruct the imagined palace. So this is where, and then I moved to the street of Kumasi talking to people, and my own experience of Kumasi, having lived in the region for almost all my life until I started a PhD. So most of us, we know that what we have in Menchia is the Asante Palace. So many people think that is the Asante Palace, even though it conflicts with the history we have learned about the Asante state, the wealth of the Asante state. So you look at the wealth of the Asante state and you go to Menchia and look at the palace and you're like, you see, again, going back to Emmanuel's point, a missing link. So how come a kingdom with this wealth living, it's not really ideal palace, so to speak. So then I started talking to people, and the few who know that the Asante kingdom, doesn't have a palace, they accept it, but they are very silent about it, partly because once you enter the Menchia Palace, and then even within the Asante state itself, there's so much respect for the office of the Asante, and even the Asante stool. So even though you might identify some loopholes in the administration of Asante kings and Asante chiefs, you prefer to be silent about it. You don't want to talk about it. So maybe the aura that surrounds, the atmosphere within Menchia and also the larger Asante community also prevents us from even voicing out our disappointment about the Asante or the leaders of Asante not being able to build a new palace. But the people have creatively used a different approach to rebuilding their own palace. And this is what finally we'll go to the next slide. So in the absence of this attempt to reconstruct the Asante Palace materially, I think it still provides us a powerful mental construct, a and a different approach through which the traditional Asante palace could be incorporated. And so here, many people have decided, the few who know, they have decided to use or to appeal to the Asamando. And the Asamando is where the ancestors live. And so they believe that this is where the ancestors live. And so they think that the Asante palace is, as we speak, is in that realm. And it is independent of our senses. And they think that they have been able to rebuild in such a way that it conforms to what they have imagined about the Asante state. And so here I try to use Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism concept, and that is using the things as it appear in itself, but not things as it appear to us. And so the Asante palace lives outside the physical. It is in the noumena, it is in the Asamando. And it is very, even though it is subjective because it is at the individual level, but in the end, they are able to create an objective Asante palace because all of them agree to the principle that palace is supposed to be elegant, that palace is supposed to be magnificent, and it's supposed to correspond to the wealth of the Asante state during the 18th, 19th, and early part of the 20th century. So I'll conclude by saying that even though many people are not aware that the Asante state doesn't have a palace, the few that know this fact have been creative with how they have responded and to this material shortfall. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tony. That was fascinating. So our next speaker is Laura Routley. She's a senior lecturer in African and post-colonial politics at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom. Her current research examines prisons in West Africa, Nigeria and Ghana specifically, exploring what the purpose of the prison is seen to be and how the process of reforming prisoners is understood to take place. And her paper is From Prison to Freedom. And I apologise for the intrusion of my cat into our Zoom. Laura.
I think it's most welcome. Yes, so the full title of my paper, which I realise everybody else has on their slides and I have failed to do so, is From Prison to Freedom, Overwriting the Past and Imagining the Future. What I'm going to do in this paper, and I kind of feel like I've got too many ideas, so I'm going to try and be quite brief, and then maybe people can pick up on things that I'm not being fully clear about in the questions if you find them interesting. So I'm going to give you an intro where I'll talk a little bit about the site that I'm talking about, a little bit about my methods, and a little about the questions that I'm kind of trying to get at. I'm then going to have a section on what I call overwriting, which is what I think happens on this site, which is Freedom Park in Lagos in Nigeria, and how this kind of site talks about the past and the future. And then my final kind of slide is kind of reflection on kind of difficult heritage, and I'll come back to that concept of this difficult heritage, which kind of comes from MacDonald's work. So, the site is Freedom Park in Lagos, which was originally HMP Lagos, or Broad Street Prison in Lagos, and was like many African countries, some of the first colonial buildings built in those countries were the prisons, and the prison in Lagos was built very early, fitting with that kind of pattern across certainly much of West Africa. So it's a real kind of, it was a priority for the colonial authorities, and it was originally built kind of in wood and thatch, which was burnt down in protest quite regularly, so was then rebuilt in brick. And the rebuilding, I think the rebuilding at the time was kind of cost about, I think like 1,700, so £17,000, and the budget for the education was like £600, right? So this is something that was really invested in by the colonials. It's a big colonial symbol. And also obviously a symbol of colonial kind of control, but also colonial brutality. So we've got this colonial prison that existed, and it exists on this site until the kind of the early 1970s. It isn't actually fully clear to me exactly when the prison becomes decommissioned, right? I've heard 72, I've heard 75. It's kind of not fully clear when it goes out of use. This prison site then becomes completely unused, and it slowly deteriorates, and eventually at some point in the 80s and 90s, most of the buildings are destroyed, and it's kind of left with its walls on the outside, and it becomes basically a dumping ground. It's then been redeveloped and I'll talk about its redevelopment as a park, right? It's redeveloped as Freedom Park. And I'm going to talk about that in quite a lot more detail. But what's interesting, I think, and we'll come back to this, is this period, this redevelopment of Freedom Park, and it opens in 2010 as kind of a marker of the 50th anniversary of Nigeria's independence, right? So it's a big colonial kind of place, and it opened and it's turned into a park that's opened at Nigeria's independence 50 years later. In between, in this kind of period of ruination, it goes from being owned by the federal state, the land being owned by the federal state, and is handed to the state, right, to the state level rather than the federal level. And this is partly because they talk about putting a maternity hospital on it. It sits next to kind of one of the big hospitals in Lagos, and they're going to build this as a maternity wing on the site, but nobody wants their baby to be born on the site of this ex-prison, and it doesn't happen. Developers come in and they try and they split the site into different plots, and they try and get developers in, and it all goes bust and never occurs, right? So, and the land starts to be talked about as having been cursed, particularly hasn't been cursed by Trifa Walla Walla, and who was a famous prisoner who's in there, but in there just post-independence, and we'll come back to him. So this is kind of a site that kind of crumbles and then is kind of rebuilt as Freedom Park. And what I think reason I want to kind of talk about this kind of this period and kind of highlight this period of kind of ruination and decline is that at the heart of this, I think there was a question of how this difficult heritage was being dealt with or couldn't be dealt with, right? So this isn't a site that was kind of easy to deal with, despite being in central Lagos Island, right in the heart of, you know, the courts are just over the way, the Catholic cathedral's there, one of the biggest kind of most famous private schools in Nigeria is there. It's a central, like, it's prime real estate, right? This is, you know, it's all about location. This is prime real estate, but it isn't developed for a long time. And then I think I should say, so this is the kind of the site that we're talking about, and then it is developed, and I'll talk a little bit about my methodology. So I'm completely unhappy with my methodology because I kind of went and did something very preliminary, I thought. I went and visited the site, and I thought it would take a lot of time to get kind of access to people, and actually it was relatively easy to get access to people. I interviewed the architect Theo Lawson, who kind of was the kind of powerhouse behind the redevelopment of the site. Within like the first day I got there, and then I was very confused because I thought that was going to take ages to set up. But I did manage to visit the site, and I did manage to do some interviews on the site, but it wasn't very robust. And the idea was that I would go back, and I haven't been able to go back because of the current situation in which we're in. I also wanted to do some more archival work, which I was due to do. I had booked two lots of time to do that, one at the end of March and one at the end of April, when I was going to go to the archives and Kew, and that also didn't happen. So this is something I'm kind of slightly unhappy about, but I think there's still something interesting to say. So the park, and I've already been moved on. So the park was first mooted into discussions about millennium projects for Lagos. And it came out of a discussion both about how the Lagos were going to mark the millennium, but also came out of a discussion about how buildings in the colonial era architecture in the city, and a discussion amongst architecture about its decline and how it was kind of being eroded and what they were going to do about that. So there was kind of an interest in what these colonial sites and what was happening to them. But it also came out of a motivation, this is Theo Lawson's kind of terms to me, that, you know, Lagos was a global city that should have a park, right? So, you know, and he says, you know, he said to me, you know, London has Hyde Park, New York has Central Park, Lagos should have a park. So there's something there as well. And as I said, it was created to mark the 50th anniversary of Nigeria's independence. So Theo Lawson's redevelopment of the site is a fascinating take on very different approaches to those often taken towards heritage buildings and heritage sites, which are often either about conserving or restoring, right? So they're either about just making sure the walls don't crumble any further, or they're about kind of recreating and restoring it to a particular era so that people can kind of see what it was like. Neither of those approaches are taken at all, and I'll talk about it. Rather, it takes what I've termed an approach I've termed overwriting, right? So by the time it's redeveloped, it's only the outer walls that are left, and most of this work is done from a plan of the site that you saw in the previous slide. So the creation of the park was undertaken following this plan, which was held at the National Museum archive just down the road. The prison spaces and the different parts of the prison are kind of reimagined and what I've termed overwritten by new structures and spaces that reference those of the prison, but reform them in new ways. So to give you an example of this, what you can see on your screen now is you've got on the left-hand side, you've got the stage, which is at the site where the gallows where condemned prisoners were executed. And then you've got one set of rebuilt, what are they called, pagoda cells, pergola cells. And it's those are now, you can perhaps just about see, they have power, which in Lagos is quite a thing. They have power sockets, and there is a generator, so there is power in those. And people go and they work in them, and particularly kind of musicians use them as practice spaces. So they're kind of used and they're kind of open, but they are on the plan of the cells. There's other, and this theme works across of kind of rebuilding and reusing for very different uses, but on the same kind of plan and referencing what was there previously in some ways. So, so the gallery, so there's some of these kind of symbolic references, but other references are more direct. So the food court area in the park is, you know, on the site where the kitchens used to be. There is a museum on the site, which is in what was the administrative block where the records would have been held. So there's all these kinds of things. Interestingly enough, where the European officers, prison officers would have been housed is kind of around the back of what is the art gallery, and has just been is designated as the car park. It's kind of one of the least marked areas. So some of this works quite well, I think. Some of it's kind of a bit more tangential. So there's a second stage area, which is a kind of smaller stage area, which is where the women's prison was. And it was kind of explained to me that this is where they thought they might do children's performances, but it kind of, the relationship, I think, works less well. Next slide, please. So on the next slide where it comes up, what you'll see is there's some other elements of the park. So what I want to talk about a little bit here is, like many heritage sites, and I don't think this is unique to Freedom Park, is while it's kind of dealing with it's the history, the colonial history and the history of the prison, it's also kind of projecting into the future in a number of different ways. So it kind of creates a narrative arc, and this is some of the things that I think is quite interesting. It is very much this idea that you've gone from kind of prison to freedom, right? You've had this colonial era in which you've got kind of brutality and stuff, but that isn't kind of dwelt on, right? The focus isn't on the brutality. We don't have much descriptions of the brutality. There isn't kind of, I mean, it must have been quite a harrowing place to be, but that isn't kind of focused on, which is quite different, for example, when as I know some of you have, if you go to Constitution Hill and go around apartheid era prisons, some of the brutality of that and the lack of food rations and lots of other things is kind of discussed and placed in front of you, and that doesn't happen. And so, but what you've got is a kind of an idea of the park almost being a site in which kind of Nigeria's prosperous future is already starting to be made present. And what was striking to me, as Joe said, I've kind of worked on prisons, and that I kind of came to this through being interested in prisons, is the lack of prisoners in this site in many senses. There isn't much discussion of the prisoners' experience. One of the few exceptions of this, where I think the prisoners are kind of evoked, but kind of symbolically, is the sculpture you see here, which is in what they term the skeletal cells, where actually the sculptures are, Theo Lawson tells me, made out of the barbed wire and bits that were taken off the top of the walls. So it's kind of reusing of this, and there is kind of an invoking, but they're kind of in quite an ephemeral, more symbolic way than in kind of a concrete kind of way. So one of the reasons I think you get this is because there is an idea that these things, that the brutalities in the past, and this is the new future of Nigeria, the new presence of Nigeria is not about that, and it's a moving on, and we've got this quite strong narrative arc. Some of these things come out in the way in which they kind of have a walkway of kind of fame, and Sonika appears there, and Wale Sonika has been a big supporter of the park. And the only kind of reference you get to contemporary prisoners in the park is a statue called Contemplation, which is placed near the skeletal cells. And you've got a figure that's dressed in kind of a vest and shorts, kind of uniform of a young, poor Nigerian man. And the text that accompanies this says it is, and I'm quoting here, it is general knowledge that the economic downturn is biting hard on the masses, despite the fact that the majority of the people still look for legitimate source of income. Some choose to remain idle unless turn to crime or become miscreants. So there's not a particular, there's no invitation to kind of use the visiting of this prison site to kind of have sympathy with people in contemporary Nigerian jails. So there's no focus on the non-political prisoners, but there is some focus on the political prisoners in the past. And I'm going to come back to this, because this is in some ways where this narrative arc of from prison to freedom, this idea of Nigeria overcoming its colonial past, kind of overwriting it, not eroding it, not getting rid of it, but kind of moving on from it, kind of starts to crumble a bit. So can I have the last slide, please, Neil? So what I would like to, so there's an overwriting in the park, and I can never say this word, so it's like a palimpsest nature of the park. So there's lots of layers, lots of things that are kind of half rubbed out, but you can kind of see there, and there's multiple layers. But one of the things I think that's going on in the park is kind of a bit more of a complicated narrative about Nigeria's place in the world than it kind of this initial narrative seems. The park in many senses is kind of both producing Nigeria's place in the world, right, by claiming it as a global city with a park, with a kind of engaging with heritage. And there's been a lot written about European cities and how this kind of monuments and move to kind of heritage sites is actually partly about nation building and establishing yourself as in particular kind of understandings of civilization and those kinds of things, and a long durée of your state, meaning that you have more weight as a state. But it's also, but I think most of this discussion is not for an international audience, right? So you have got this overcoming of colonialism, and you have got this moving on. And on this slide, I've got an image of that's actually a picture of a picture. So my photo is up in the museum of the gallows that were in the jail, and this is a kind of difficult heritage in some senses because it's unpleasant heritage. So it's we've got Nigeria's colonial past, in which people are kind of the body can be constrained and can actually be kind of destroyed through the gallows, and you've got this kind of nasty history that they're kind of moving away from. But you've got a much more complicated history. So the political prisoners that are talked about and most details about are actually political prisoners from just after independence. So Chief Walawa, who cursed the ground, who was told about both around, was jailed with Chief Latif Jakande and other leaders from the Action Group political party post-independence for treason, right? And he's featured in the museum. So you've got this idea of moving on, but actually you've got this kind of more complicated history post-independence that's also there. Interesting enough, Walawa appears in the museum as kind of having been interred there. You've also got, he appears in this statue. I'm sorry, the picture's perhaps a little bit small on your screen, but this statue is the statue of what I think repeatedly appear across Nigeria and appear a couple of times in the park, kind of the independence leaders of the Nigerian nation. And there's three men who appear here, and one of them is Chief of Fabini Awolowo, one is Amadu Bello, and Mandi Azikwe. They conveniently represent the three major regions of Nigeria, which loosely corresponds to the three major language groups of Nigeria, and they kind of they're often there. And Awolowo is there as this kind of both having been interred for treason, but also this kind of founding father of the country. So we've got this discussion, we've got this kind of placing of Nigeria as overcoming, but with this kind of more complicated narrative about how it's kind of moving forward. One of those things that cemented this for me, and I didn't notice when I went in it, and I was actually going back. So the picture on the right is my picture of a picture, but the one of the statue is actually from Freedom Park's website. And I was looking to see how they presented themselves. And one of the things that suddenly struck me is the name of the art gallery. And I've been to the art gallery, into the art gallery, and I hadn't noticed. The name of the art gallery is Kongi's Harvest. And Kongi's Harvest is obviously in homage to Sonika, who's a supporter of the park. But Kongi's Harvest is a play that he wrote, which was performed at the First World Festival of Black Arts in 1966. But the theme of the play is quite critical of the post-colonial kind of leadership and kind of the problems of post-colonial leadership and brutality. So it's this overarching narrative of the place is also kind of troubled, and I think it's about Nigeria's place in the world, but it doesn't give perhaps a simple answer as the initial narrative seems. Thank you. Sorry if I've gone over, Jo.
No, thank you to all of you. And that leaves us with a perfect round hour to conclude our discussions with. I'll ask everyone to wrap up answering questions just before 5:30 so that we can hand over to Julia for some concluding comments. So this is the section that's open to questions for you all, for our three speakers here. I'm going to start with a couple of comments that Nick Westcott's put in the chat while you're thinking of questions that you might want to ask. I'll read those out and then put your hand up or put a question in the chat. So the first is Daniel. The AUHQ is universally disliked by all Africans I've met as an inappropriate building, particularly the party plenum structure, compared to the UN building in Addis with magnificent African stained glass. But without the Chinese, they wouldn't have one at all, as it was a sort of free gift. So they make the best of it. That's a comment for you to reflect on. Also from Nick Westcott to Tony. I think the current Mania Palace is a good example of a successful African appropriation of Western building style. It is both African and modern. So that's a question for, or sort of comment for the two of you to reflect on. Dawit's also got a question for Daniel. And his question is about methodological and logical connections between the justifications you've described on why you've chosen Ethiopia and Nigeria as study sites. Do you think being populous countries in Africa makes a difference on views of people on Pan-Africanism as compared to people's imagination about Pan-Africanism in less populous countries? In the middle of your presentation, if I'm not mistaken, you told us the socioeconomic status of participants influenced people's imagination. Do you think we can reach at this conclusion without doing statistical tests which show correlation between participants' backgrounds, income, age, sex, religious affiliations, etc.? We've got another question for Daniel in the chat from Emmanuel. So I'll read that out and then maybe hand over for some comments back and then more questions. So, was there an attempt to get people's impression of the old African Union, then the OAU HQ building, compared to the new one? They're both in the same compound. The previous one was a continental architectural design competition that was awarded to a Nigerian architect, whereas the new gift is done by a Chinese design institute with limited local professional mandate. A larger question is probably, what is an African imagination as expressed in architecture? Can all Africans ever agree to this? Can all Europeans agree to a European imagination? All Americans? Don't you think this attempt to bake a collective imagination is politically challenging and may result in something very international, no identity, safe, politically safe, resulting in just what the AU HQ is? Same challenge as we attempt to define Ethiopian architecture. Will it be inspired by the North or the South, by the East or the West? In the end, one ends up to the whitewash, Frankfurtish hotel lobby-like of our new government offices. Okay, so Daniel and Tony, some things for you to reflect on there, and then we'll take more questions. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the excellent questions. One from Nick, I have already answered on the comment chat box, but just to say a few more words, yeah, I agree. The African Union building has been universally disliked by almost everyone I spoke to in Nigeria and in Addis Ababa, also in other parts of Africa. So, yeah, the African Union is an organization which is very, very financially constrained, and the African states doesn't seem to take it seriously. They don't pay their fees on time, and some of the most famous and popular donors like Gaddafi are no more. So it has been struggling financially. Yeah, but the comment that I used to get from some quarters of my informants was that the building was completely designed, built, and furnished by the Chinese without any kind of participation from Africans. Even those artworks that you see displayed in the lobby of the African Union headquarters building were imported from China. All the furniture, all the screens, everything came from China. So there is nothing in terms of contributions from any of the African countries. So that makes the popular dislike of the building much more stronger. So David asked me about my methodology. Does being populist makes a difference? Absolutely not. Some of the countries which Pan-Africanism has a very strong root, like China and like Ghana, are not as populous as Nigeria. But Nigerians at present moment seems to claim that they better represent Africa, and that they are on the basis of that claim. They are asking for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. I don't know where that kind of thinking comes from, but that's their perception. So the fact that Nigeria has one of the biggest populations is important, but I don't think it's a determining factor. And when I'm doing this research, it's ethnographic, and I don't. My aim is not to make a certain kind of generalization about the whole of Africa. It's just a kind of illustration of how people think about Pan-Africanism and how the building provokes that sort of imagination. In terms of the socio-economic status, yeah, it absolutely makes a difference, because middle-class Africans are more aware of Pan-Africanism than people who usually are or are more concerned about the everyday day-to-day life. So class, I think, makes much more difference. So in that respect, that's one interesting finding which came out from this research. Emmanuel, I don't know which one has asked me those questions. I think it's Emmanuel.
Yeah, Emmanuel. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of people's impression of the old building, yeah, both of the old and the new buildings are located in the same compound, and people are much more positively disposed towards the old building. They have several reasons for that. One being the texture of the building is being kind of rough as compared to the soft texture of the new building, and it's kind of earthy, and people would say that it reminds some Africans' connections to organic materials, Africans' connection to nature and sustainability. And it was originally built by Haile Selassie to host a police academy, and it is African built, and people feel much more attached to the kind of building that has been constructed by their own government than a new one which is gifted from a foreign government. So that have been the reasons which most of my informants were mentioning. In terms of what is African imagination, there's no such a thing as African imagination. Imagination is imagination, but there is a certain sort of Pan-African imagination, which people, it's a kind of imagination which we see when you read the biography of Kwame Nkrumah, that the kind of vision that they have for Africa, like integrated Africa, both economically and politically united Africa, Africa which is independent from foreign influence and intervention. We may not agree with those kind of imaginations, but people believe in them, and people believe that those kind of imaginations are not materialized because of the leadership problem that we are having since independence of most African states. So yeah, what's unique about the idea of imagination is it is somehow connected with the concepts of Pan-Africanism. I think I have addressed most of the questions. Have I?
Yeah. Over to Tony if you want to offer some reflections, and then we'll bring in some more questions.
Yes, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Next, for that observation. Yes, I already answered that in the chat, but maybe just to highlight it a little bit. So, you're right. The current palace sort of incorporates aspect of tradition and modernity. But my critique was, the Asante sort of wanted to restore the pre-1874 palace. So I thought that at worst, maybe he should have limited himself to at least the layout of that pre-1874 palace, and not separating the section of the Asante, the Queen Mother, from the Asante, the king. So and also I think once and then also building a guest house, and now this is where the Asante lives. And so traditionally, I know that in the Asante cosmology, the Asante is supposed to live in the section where the deities and the gods lived. So once you separate the Asante, moving him to the guest house, leaving the gods, the ancestors, and all the spiritual All the others, I mean, in the main palace, I think you limit the communication between the two groups. So because we believe that the Asantean receive instructions from the deities and the ancestors. And so once you separate them, the question that I ask is, how does that separation limit effective and unbroken flow of communication and relationship between the Asantean and the deities? So that was my major critique, and also even the separation between the two. So even though I like the idea of appropriating aspect of European building technologies, I also think that it's in the end came with a cost to Asante culture. And again, back to, I think he maybe to some extent failed with his own project because he wanted to restore that ancient palace. But in the end, he complicated the whole project, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. We've got another round of questions coming in. So from IB for Tony, how has this idea of a new palace for the Asantean been weaponized and or appropriated by political elites in Ghana? I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on the politics around the site of the burnt Asante Palace. Is this where the one built by the British stands? If not, does that site also contribute to this idea of an imagined new palace? So that's that question. And Philip, I believe you've got your hand up. So if I hand over to you to ask it.
Yes, some of it is probably a repetition of my questions earlier on in the day about the funding of the African Union. I think it's Daniel. I mean, generally, what do you think? A lot of like the funding. The funding issue. What's really the root of that? Because governments usually do manage to rally people around large, to fund large projects like the dam in Ethiopia, and the African Union was a fraction of that cost, and they could have gotten the whole continent involved to fund it. So I'm curious, why is there this lack of, it seems to be reflect a lack of enthusiasm, or maybe, do people not really think the AU has a proper mandate? And the second question is, with 15 parliament buildings across the continent and the AU, and they all kind of look the same and don't reflect the, lack innovation and contextualization, do you really think that's due to financial constraints, or do you think it's a deliberate way to enforce uniformity and through that basically withhold power and ownership from the local communities? Because I think that's, these are flagship buildings, and is this a way to really maintain power or even gain power by not letting African countries have ownership of, of their buildings visually and even indirectly perhaps of their politics? Okay, thank you, Philip. Julia, you've also got your hand up, so can I take you next, please?
Yep, mine's a sort of an impression I got from listening to the three papers together, and this it seemed to me that together you sort of find this collection of ideals, so the Pan-Africa, pre-colonial Africa, future African state, the future Nigerian state. And I was interested in the way that all three papers played around with the ideas of how you represent these through buildings. And I wondered if one of the things that really struck me was it almost seems as though the AU building is problematic because it was built and therefore doesn't express the ideal in any way that seems to be satisfactory. The Asante Palace is problematic because it hasn't been built, although I think, as Tony and I have discussed in the past, and I'd like to hear him sort of reflect on this a bit more, is actually in some ways is it better that it wasn't built, because in a way that it never loses its idealization because it's not actually a real thing, and so people can't criticize it. It's always still in your mind as something perfect and wonderful from the past. And then I'm very struck with Laura's idea of overwriting and the idea of, I just wonder whether, am I being a bit simplistic in thinking, is this Nigerian engagement with this difficult site and what to do with it a bit more of a kind of sort of grounded, not kind of prosaic, a normal, or kind of a sense of a kind of attempt to face up to something that's more messy and real, and to sort of attain some kind of sense of a normality of what this future state might look like. Reflections, really, just for comments.
Excellent, thank you. And I've noticed that Teo also has their hand up, so I'll hand over to you and then hand back to the speakers, if that's okay, Teo.
Hello. This is a statement of appreciation, if that's acceptable. I'm in Liverpool. I used to be an architect. I trained here in Liverpool. I'm from Nigeria. I lived in Lagos. And I particularly enjoyed this session. The image of the sacked palace, the Asante palace, the violence, the colonial violence that sort of depicted is one part of the story. And then you go to the AU building, which is gifted and is very unsatisfactory to practically all Africans on all levels, aesthetic or even spiritual. And then Freedom Park, to which I have been, which I didn't actually, I was very glad to see the original plan and the dating, and to learn that prisons were among the first buildings to be built by the colonialists. That just tells the story. But to me, it's a great symbol, the fact that architects and artists have taken over that building and allowed us as Nigerians, and I'm sure it'll be the same in other countries or former colonies, to take charge of the narrative of the buildings and use them in our own way. And I think that hope that in time, the AU building in Addis Ababa will receive the same treatment. It will be Africanized or Ethiopianized and used in a better way. But these three papers, these three buildings that we're looking at actually tell a wonderful story that is not complete if we don't go back to 1878 and the Berlin Conference, where the Europeans carved up our continent. And as the recently sacked AU ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Arikana Chihambori Kwao, keeps trying to educate the world, that was the beginning of an intentional process to keep Africa subservient to Europe and the rest of the world, to such an extent that we can receive a gift, a totally inappropriate gift, now from China, who some would argue are the new empire over Africa, and there's nothing we can do about it. And she was sacked by the then chairman or president of the AU, who was from one of the French former colonies. I'm pretty sure is on the instructions of the French government. So I just think that we should never forget, and again, Nkrumah, had he and his group had their way in 1963, in the formation of the OA, on the Organization of African Unity, as a Pan-Africanist entity, we wouldn't be in this position now. But what can we do about it now? Well, at least remember that history and continue to support those who are activists in the call for new Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Teo. So I'll hand back to our speakers for comments on those interesting questions and comments. I'm going to start, I think, with Laura first, then Tony, then Daniel. So Laura, over to you.
Yeah, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think I have any kind of direct questions, but I think there is a set of things that interesting to reflect on. And I think one of the things that I find interesting about Freedom Park is I think it is an interesting approach to kind of trying to do some of this kind of decolonial kind of approach towards some of the architecture that's left behind, these kind of colonial ruins, these colonial remnants that are littered across African cities and ex-colonial countries in general. And I think it's an interesting kind of engagement with trying not to just, the development didn't happen. It's not a shopping mall. It's not, it's not something that's just kind of stuck on the top. It is trying to engage with that, but it's actually doing something very new. And I think, it's this is, I've kind of talked about it as a park, but it's an arts venue as well. So there's lots going on there. There's lots of events going on there. There's lots of exhibitions going on there. It's kind of a vibrant space. And I think that idea of people coming in, the caution about the people coming in, which we've kind of talked about, other speakers have talked about in other contexts, is the class one. So you have to, partly because I think the park has to be kind of self-funding. So the land's still owned by the federal state, but they don't get any funding from the federal state. So it's kind of got to be self-funding. There is actually an entry fee, which for me isn't very much, but I would imagine, the women selling oranges outside probably can't afford that entry fee. So it's kind of, it's there, but there is kind of a class set of dimensions. And I think there is kind of a particular kind of elite image of Nigeria that's kind of being created in this space, which is not a bad one, but it is a particular view, right? So I think it is a really interesting site in this way. And I think one of the things I find, I was trying to get at the end of this, and I found Antonio's comments really helpful. And one of the things that I kind of to highlight is the Broad Street Jail is kind of erected in 1872, so prior to the Berlin Conference. This is before the continent's even kind of been carved up, right? These prisons are being built. And I think one of the things that happens is this space is really vibrant and it's kind of doing this decolonisation, but I think it is then troubled, right? Some of it perhaps more consciously so than others, about by this kind of post-independence history in Nigeria and the not so settled politics of Nigeria, right? And it kind of tries to settle them. We've got the statue of the three leaders together in front of the map of Nigeria, and it's got lots of statues all over it of different kind of traditional ceremonies and traditional practices across the country, and it's kind of trying to be fairly uniting. But I think it is troubled by this history because we have got this kind of period. It's kind of open for at least 12 years post-independence, and actually a lot of the political prisoners in there in that time are kind of some of the more famous political prisoners. And so it's not like this isn't, it doesn't end at the space doesn't stop its kind of brutality at the end of colonialism. And the name of the art gallery kind of referencing this kind of play that talks about this kind of the problematic nature of kind of governance post-independence and the challenges of that, and actually the violence involved in that, I think it means that it's kind of it's got this really hopeful thing, and I think I wouldn't want to diminish that, but I think there is also other things going on, and I think that perhaps speaks to where Nigeria is kind of at.
Thank you, Laura. Tony?
Yes. So let me continue. So Julia, thanks. You and I, we've spoken about this for quite some time. So I think it is good that it hasn't been built and rebuilt. And I wonder if that is a statement in itself. And I just think that they're just going to play around it. Just tell people that, okay, plans are always far advanced to the rebuilding of the palace, but I think successive Asante case will be playing around this. And that is what I think for quite some time, and possibly it might not be rebuilt because I don't really see the willingness, even though you go to Menchia and I've seen the building plans, I've seen everything, but I don't think they have prioritized it a lot, and because we don't see the attempt to create funds to rebuild the palace. And meanwhile, they spend so much on festivals, they spend so much on other celebrations. So I think, and again, I think it's also powerful. It becomes more sacred when we have it in our minds, because again, once it is built, I doubt there is no way they can reconstruct the pre-1874 palace. Definitely, they will incorporate aspect of, modernity. So, and once you do that, the Asante state subjects itself to criticisms, and especially when Asante is noted as a region or one of the states that really resisted imperialism, and even till now, it is many people think that. So I think it's a statement, and I think they're just going to play around it for a very long time. It will never be rebuilt, in my opinion. So back to AB's question. So let me begin with the second one, which is pretty easy. Yeah, so the site of the pre-1874 palace, I didn't have the time to talk about the special relocation of the Mencha Palace. When it was burnt, as part of establishing their control, the British built a fort on the premises of the palace, the pre-1874 palace. And again, I think architecturally also demonstrating the transfer of power from Asante to the British. So now we are in charge. So the fort was now at the center of Asante, so to speak. And even with that, I don't really know if at some point, even if they decide if they finally make a commitment to rebuild the palace, I wonder if they will go back to the original site, because from my oral history research, I'm told that site is the center of Kumasi, and that traditionally palace is supposed to be built at the center of the city. So I don't know. When the British took over, they pushed Asante to the sort of, at the time, peripheral neighborhood. So this is where Mencha Palace is now. So I don't know if they decide to rebuild, I don't know if they will go back, because now the fort is still there and is generating revenue for the government of Ghana and for the Asante state. So I don't know if they will also demolish it and rebuild the Imagine Palace. I don't know. And so for the second question, which is great, and I've been thinking about it for some time now. And I think, again, we'll go back to the 1925, when the British built a palace for the Asante, and Asante's rejection of the palace until they paid the total cost. I know that politicians, I don't know if your political allies, if you are specifically referring to politicians. I know politicians, they are taking advantage of, I know the Fanti in the central region of Ghana, in 2012, during the administration of President J.E.A. Mills, who is late now, he donated a building for the Ogwa Mahine, so the chief of Central Region, or the king of the Central Region, because I'm told, again, their palace was also not to the level that was expected of the Fanti. So the government of Ghana donated a building for the Fanti state. And again, I think sort of the NDC, this was the NDC government trying to establish good relations with this region. And now the MPP is in power. And the MPP, the president, Nana Akufo-Addo, I'm told, it's been rumored that he had sponsored the renovation of a palace in his state, which is the Achimabwakwa. But the question that I asked is, so would we get to a point where these politicians would also try, especially when they get to know that Asante doesn't have a palace, would they make any attempt to offer support to the rebuilding of the palace? And I think I don't really I don't really know, so I can only speculate, but I doubt that the Asante will give in. I think the Asante will prefer to raise their own funds and build their own palace without any government intervention. And I'm saying this based on their treatment to how the attitude towards the British and sort of the pride that we see among the Asante. So I think they will prefer to raise their own funds and build their own palace, but I don't know. So it can only be speculations.
Thank you, Tony. So before I hand over to Daniel, just to say, if you've got any more questions out there, do put your hand up in the chat or write them in the chat box. But I'll hand over now to Daniel so that he can answer those final questions and comments, and then we'll see if we've got anything else. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the questions and the comments from Tayo. Regarding the question about funding from Philip, in my personal opinion, the issue doesn't seem to be the lack of capacity of African states to construct a $200 million building for their regional organization. There seems to be a huge lack of commitment, and also there seems to be certain kind of desire from certain African countries for the African Union. They just don't want it to work. This dysfunctionality, as Shabal Indalus would say, is instrumental in advancing their own interests. It's the African Union annual summits are, for example, has been seen in many countries or by many leaders as a place where the states seek to project a kind of appearance of power, appearance of control, appearance of admiration, and the sovereignty. So the union is more about individual states than the intergovernmental relations in itself. And when it comes to the union itself, it is it has a kind of social capital, a kind of cultural capital that the European Union doesn't have. It has the ideological foundation of Pan-Africanism, which has no parallel elsewhere else. But it's not effective in using it as organizing principle or as a means of kind of mobilizing the public to raise funds for its own projects. This partly may be because the organization is intergovernmental and it is run by African leaders who take the position of chairmanship each year, rather than the organization having its own independent identity, its own programs, and its own strategy. So, on the other hand, I understand that all of African leaders, African countries actually, almost all of African countries are very young, and because of that, they are jealous about their sovereignty. And the African Union, compared to the European Union, is a very young organization, and it is something which one would expect an organization to behave in a way that the African Union has been behaving, due to its inexperience and due to the young age of the African states. So that's what can I say?
Thank you, Daniel. I just want to thank Teo for posting a project he's working on, a performance project called Mapping Greatness, into the chat with a really moving poem, which you might all like to take a read of. And there are details there for you to look further. We've got a few final questions that have come in from Emmanuel. Firstly, to Tony, do you think that there's a way in which this separation between the king and ancestors reflects a certain shift in Asante cosmology? And also from Emmanuel to Laura, this idea of overwriting in Lagos Park is interesting. I wonder if you have come across any parallels in other parts of Africa. And to Daniel, I'm starting to think that what's lacking in this quest of an African aesthetic, whether it is possible or not, is a lacuna in architectural theory in this area. What do you think? Does anybody else want to jump in with questions at this point, or shall this be the final handing over to the speakers?
Can I just?
I can't see any hands, and I can't see any questions in the chat. Then,
sorry, can I just come in there?
Please do.
Can I just, once those three questions of Emmanuel's have been asked, I'd really like to know his take on his final question to Daniel. So I'd quite like Emmanuel to answer his own question.
Okay, great. And it looks like Benjamin has his hand up. So Benjamin, I'll let you come in at this point.
Thank you so much, first of all, for this incredible webinar. I'm a former exchange student from SOAS, so I'm based in Germany, and I'm a student of architecture and African development at the same time. So I've made some experiences as an intern in 5 African countries. For instance, I've been to China 1 year ago, approximately, and I'm really interested in this materialistically embodied African architecture. So we've talked a lot about kind of the Chinese diaspora realizing buildings in Africa, but I think we also should focus on the other way around. So on the African diaspora living in China, for instance, there's a settlement called Africa Town or Chocolate City in Guangzhou, nearby Hong Kong. And I visited this spot and I'm currently working on a paper which is also about the materialistically embodiment of African architecture in this special spot. So I think this could be also interesting to focus on such kind of topics, because in the course of the New Silk Road Initiative and the growing bilateral relations, for instance, I think this is also very important, because Africans in China are very constrained in empowering themselves and symbolizing their identity, their culture, because the Chinese are kind of not welcoming in that case. But Africans are welcoming Chinese people to their continent, and this kind of relation is very unbalanced. Yeah, so I just wanted to make that statement, and if we can discuss a bit about that, that would be awesome as well. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Benjamin. And if any of the other speakers that have spoken today have comments on the questions that have been asked here, or in general, things that they want to say, perhaps maybe you want to say something about that last question. But Tony, why don't I start with you, Daniel, then Laura for now, and then Emmanuel, I'm coming to you.
So my response to Emmanuel, you're right. And I make that argument with in this chapter. So I mean, I think so, but the only I can only speculate at this point, because some of these questions tied to this Asante cosmology, we can only get answers from the Asantean, or maybe the top sub-chiefs of the Asante. But, it's very difficult having conversations. I mean, of course, people working on oral history cannot even talk to the Asante, right? And he is the only person who can tell us the impact of the separation with respect to how he relates with the deities and ancestors. So in the absence of that, we can only speculate. But I think that you're right. I think that in this era, they don't really need the ancestors as they did in the past, where even when they were building houses, they will have to pour libation, asking the gods, asking the ancestors to be good to them for the sustenance of the building. But now they have people like you, architects, right? So they trust what you guys can do. So I think they are gradually relegating the advice that in the past they have received from their ancestors and gods. Yeah. So That's what I think, yeah.
Great, thank you. Daniel, any final thoughts on these final questions?
I think Emmanuel has to answer his own question. So I'm not from, my background is from architecture. So I am importing theories and methodology from anthropology, sociology, and political science. So I'm not the right person, I think, to comment on whether there is enough architectural theory which talks about African aesthetics or not. But I came across quite a lot of fascinating readings about fabrics and so on different parts of Africa. Maybe we can borrow those sorts of theories from from anthropology, material anthropology, and material sociology and other disciplines to enrich our understanding of African aesthetics. I don't know. What do you think, Emmanuel?
Should I jump in or Laura goes?
I think this is a good time for you to jump in. It's a natural point in the conversation, and then I'll come
Daniel,
to you.
I think this is because we had a conversation specifically about architecture theory in Johannesburg, if you do remember. And so I was starting to wonder if you had come to some conclusion as far as that is concerned. But I think this is definitely the case for me. Having in some cases taught architecture design theory, you will come across Western architecture theory that sort of tries to tie certain ideas from philosophy, of course, Western philosophy, Western sociology, to how architecture is done in that context. But you will not find quite as much literature in that regard in Africa. And it could be that, this whole quest for an African or a Pan-African aesthetic or an architectural expression is impossible and is needless and is pointless. However, I think there's still a need for in a sense, architecture theorists to actually start to put some of this into writing and then start a debate that would move us forwards in this regard. So yes, I think for me, the debates are because in the pedagogy, there isn't that much literature in that regard to drive that conversation. And a lot of it just remains speculative or just like very shaky opinions from different people so far. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Laura?
Sorry, I'm just struggling to unmute myself. I'd made Emmanuel big on my screen and then it wouldn't let me do anything else. Clearly, I just wanted to hear more from you, Emmanuel. I think some of the last questions are about architecture, which, like Daniel, I'm not an architect, so I'm not in a great position to talk about this. But I think Irene mentioned it earlier, that kind of idea that actually even traditional architecture often would have been borrowing, right? And I think European architecture has often been borrowing, right? So we have a period of architecture in the UK, which is kind of imperfectly kind of trying to borrow classical ideas from Greece and Rome, right? And it kind of, and it's this the idea. So I think so there is this kind of idea that actually a lot of things are often borrowing, but I think there is also at the same time something, and I think the particular thing about this is that it's partly about power, and it's partly about what we're talking about here today, which is that architecture is kind of related to politics. So when in the UK they're trying to borrow these kind of columns from Greece and Rome. I don't know my architectural history. These architects are probably scowling at me, but there's an idea of taking on. This is kind of an idea of taking on power, right? These were powerful kind of empires, and we're taking on that power. And I think in the modernist architecture in Africa, you've got some of this trying to take on that power, but I think there is also a need and an understanding desire to actually, we don't need to take that power, we have our own, right? So we have our own kind of set of things going on. And I think the architecture. And the architecture between Newcastle and Leicester is different, right? So the idea that it will be somehow the same between Addis and Johannesburg and Lagos doesn't, like. So I think it will be, there won't be an African architecture, but that doesn't mean to say that actually thinking about an African architecture and thinking about what that would look like and thinking about what that's going to be, that is going to be African or Nigerian or Lagosian or whatever, isn't an important set of conversations. And I think, and thinking about those things about what does it mean to have, Irene was talking about, houses that are set up for nuclear families rather than houses that are set up for how people live. These things are actually very practical, as well as they're kind of they're about how people engage with stuff, right? They're not just it's not just the outside, it's actually the function as well. I don't think there's anything else, was there, Joe, that I should have been commenting on?
I think there was a question about any other examples of overwriting in Africa.
Sorry. Yes, there was. I got carried away by Emmanuel's question. I don't know of them, Emmanuel, and I'd love to, because I think it's a really interesting site, and I'm sure there must be, because Africa's a big place. Right, and there's a lot going on, but I don't know where they are, and I'd be really interesting to know. And I'm sure they exist in different ways. And I want to I've just applied for a grant. Joe told me to apply for a grant when I last saw it, so I've applied for a grant. And actually, some of this is looking at some of these spaces and reuses of things. And I think there is a whole set of things about colonial spaces and how they've been reused, and that is a much bigger set of things to talk about.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura. I'm going to hand over to IB, who's got some thoughts on Benjamin's question. And then Tony tells me he's got a final question for Daniel. And then I'm going to hand over to Julia.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thanks to Benjamin for that. I'll start by saying I'm interested to read his forthcoming paper because some of the things that you're talking about are things that I've sort of figured out from this side of reading, China-Africa relations, which is looking at how the relationship plays out in Africa. And so I talk about, this asymmetry that you're talking about, that, China, we welcome, we as in the positionality of as an African. So Africans welcome China, and yet what you're also implying is that in this kind of enclave in Guangdong, we don't see this kind of welcome, as it were. So in terms of, I think part of it is how this welcome, plays out in Africa is that the African ruling elites bend backwards to accommodate China. And sometimes they will truncate the institutional framework to ensure that, the way in which the Chinese want to deliver something, whether it's, a particular, project, it becomes sort of like China-led and China-influenced. But I want to end by two things. The Chinese, if you look at the China-Africa relations, this is more like at sort of like at very state-centric. And what you are introducing here is something that actually is sort of like a new ground of looking at people-to-people relations between the Chinese people and the African. There's very limited literature on that, I think, because of the nature of the relationship. But there is something interesting that happened in China in 2013, and I think it will be it will be good to actually follow it up. So there was a school that was ravaged by an earthquake in China, and the Congo Brazzaville. It funded the rebuilding of that school. So I saw this story on China Daily, So it's, in terms of it's a very authentic kind of story. But it would be interesting to then find out when Congo was rebuilding this school, the kind of, architectural, considerations that they used to build the school, and also even in terms of the construction, firms that they used, it would be a very good contrast. I'd never really thought about it to look at it closely, but now that Benjamin raises these things, this is a very interesting aspect to look at how Africans engage with China. And we know that during COVID, there were a number of African countries that donated to China. One of them being Equatorial Guinea, they gave out $2 million to China. So this relationship, there are some of these nuggets that we can pull out and see whether, we confirm the asymmetry or there are some other, ideas that emerge from this evolving relationship. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you as well. And I can send you the paper if you want to. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So Tony, I'm going to hand quickly over to you to briefly ask Daniel something. And then Daniel, can you answer
it? Daniel, thanks, Joe. So Daniel, I really enjoy reading your paper and the others, yeah. So, but I was thinking about your discussion on the African Union War and trying to juxtapose it to how wars are used in Asante, maybe pre-colonial Asante. So I was just thinking that, do you think that maybe we could also look at another perspective where the wars or the AU war wasn't really built to isolate the AU from the larger Ethiopian or African community, but rather sort of creating space to facilitate the operations of the AU, but still welcoming members of Ethiopian society, members of the African society into their space.
So your question is that there's a deliberate attempt to isolate the AU from the community which is hosting it, or? Tony, have I got your question right?
Oh, sorry. So my question is under your discussion on the texture of Pan-Africanism in public discourses.
Yeah.
And the very first paragraph where you talk about the wars acting as barriers and sort of isolating the AU from the surrounding city and the society. And I'm just wondering if we could also look at it from this perspective where it wasn't necessarily isolating itself from the larger Ethiopian society, because in Ghana, for instance, many institutions and businesses try to create walls around their structures, but it doesn't mean that they don't invite. They are dealing with, even the banks, they are dealing with the people. So even though they have walled the main structure, they are inviting the general public. So I was just thinking that maybe we could also look at that perspective where it wasn't necessarily AU isolating itself from Ethiopia or from the people, but maybe creating space to facilitate its operation. So if you go in there, then it means that you have a business to do with the AU. So it's not just open to everyone, even though it is open to the general public, but you can only enter, we can only go in when you have a business or something to do at the AU.
Yes, I agree, absolutely. I mean, when I say the AU has been a kind of insular kind of an institution which doesn't allow people to come in and visit it, I don't mean that it should have been completely open to anyone who wants to go in and visit. It's a very important institution. They seem to think that they are very important. And so if anything, any kind of security compromise happens, then it will be a problem for the African Union and also to the Ethiopian government. But my point is that when you go to the East African community, I haven't been there, but when I checked online, they allow the public and students to visit their headquarters. I've been to New York to the United Nations headquarters. You pay a certain amount of money and you can go and visit, and they'll show you where the most important decisions are made. They can't even take you to the chamber of the Security Council. When it comes to the African Union, it is completely shut for the public. There is no way that one could go there and visit as an African. This is something which has been highlighted by my Nigerian informants who had been in transit in Addis Ababa for a day or for hours, and who wished to visit the African Union but refused access. So I mean things that way, not in the context of the AU getting a certain kind of space to do its own job.
Great. And Irene's just asking you another quick question. I hope it's not going to be too long for you to answer it, Daniel, because we're running out of time. Yeah. But she was just wondering if designers adopted an international style for a purpose, not to offend any African countries, since there are several African architectures.
Yeah, that's exactly what the chief engineer of the African Union told me about the building. He said the building is neutral, so no African country is going to complain of not being represented there. But some of the architects that I talked to both in Nigeria and Ethiopia believe that they can come up with a new way of representing Africa. But it requires innovation and imagination on the part of the designers and architects. That's the claim being made by the architects I talked to. But you are right, yeah, that's a justification from the African Union side.
Excellent. Well, that concludes this fantastic final panel, and I'll just hand over to Julia to say some final words, if that's okay, Julia.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Thank you, everybody. I'm not going to say much at all, just a couple of things. And the first thing is to say thank you to all the speakers and everybody that attended. We've had a really good turnout. I didn't anticipate anything this big, and I'm very pleased. Brilliant questions. The discussion has been fascinating. I've been taking notes and I've got all sorts of ideas. I'm really delighted. And the final thing is a bit of a plug, which is that we've been working quite hard on our social media. You can sign up to our Twitter, Facebook, look at our website. We've even got a brand new YouTube channel. So you can find out all sorts of interesting things about the project. And we're also just about to launch a new initiative called Africa's Favourite Building, which we're going to invite as many people as we possibly can who've got an opinion on the subject to nominate their favourite building in the continent. And I'm going to be asking all of you, all the speakers today, for sure, to be nominating their favourite building. But I would be really thrilled if anybody that wants to, all the people that came today, I'm sure you've all got thoughts and opinions about this. Just keep an eye on our website, follow us on Twitter, and you'll get the latest, hottest news on this. But I'm hoping to build up a really interesting, I should think fairly heated discussion about what's Africa's best or favourite building. Oh, thanks, Sonal, you've put up the link to the website. Otherwise, thank you so much and have a lovely evening.